Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today's topic is about ma malakat aymanukum, or what is commonly understood as what your right hand possesses according to the Quran. In traditional Islam, we are told that ma malakat aymanukum mentioned in the Quran can refer to war captives and or slaves. Some believe that it refers to specifically female slaves. However, what's interesting is that the Quran already talks about war captives, like in 47:4, and it says you may then either set them free or ransom them until the war ends. In 76:80, it says, and they give food out of love to the captive. So God does talk about war captives. But we want to examine exactly what does ma malakat aymanukum actually refer to in the Quranic perspective, and how they are to be treated from a Quranic view. Let's begin. The first thing I'd like to mention is that ma malakat aymanukum occurs 15 times in the Quran in 4 different forms. Ma malakat aymanukum, ma malakat aymanuhum, ma malakat yaminuka, ma malakat aymanuhunna. So what we're going to do is define the phrase ma malakat aymanukum from the root, and then we're going to examine every single verse in which this phrase occurs. So let's begin with the phrase malakat aymanukum. The first word we're going to define is malakat, and it comes from the root malaka, which means to possess power over something. And we can see this definition in the Quran, like in 27:23. I found a woman tamlikuhum, ruling them. 16:28. Those whom their lives are terminated by the malaika, the caretakers and or the angels. And in 24:61, there is no blame upon yourselves if you eat at your homes or the homes of your fathers, or that malaktum, what you possess of their keys. So the root malaka refers to possessing power over something. And in the phrase malakat is actually in the past tense. So I would translate malakat as possessed. The second term is aymanukum, and it comes from the root yamana, which means the right side and or the symbol of power. It has a physical and a symbolic aspect. The physical aspect means the right side, and the symbolic aspect is the power. And we can see this definition in the Quran, like in 69:19. As for the one who is given his record in yaminihi, his right hand. 39:67. And the heavens will be folded in yaminihi, his power or his right hand. But what's interesting here is the form that is being used in this phrase, aymanukum. Okay, aman. Aman in the Quran is quite interesting. When we look up this form, we see that it refers to oaths, which signifies that it's a symbol of power. Like in 1691, it says, and fulfill your pledge to God when you pledge so, and do not break the aman, your oaths, after making it. 9:12. And if they break amanahum, their oaths, after making their pledge, and they challenge the authority of your system, then you may kill the leaders of rejection. They have no aman, they have no oaths. Surah 2, and do not make God the subject of your amanikum, your oaths. Be pious and righteous and reconcile among the people. God will not call you to account for your amanikum, your oaths. So the form, specifically aman in the Quran, refers to some type of oath. And here in this phrase, the phrase that's in question, it says aymanukum. So I would translate aymanukum as your oaths. So the phrase ma malakat aymanukum literally means possessed your oaths. So far, we've learned that ma malakat aymanukum, or MMA for short, literally means those possessed by your oaths. The next thing I would like to do is examine who are they according to the Quran. And although I would contend that the phrase ma malakat aymanukum, or those possessed by your oaths, is pretty self-explanatory, I would like to go through some Quranic verses to gain hints and clues to gain a better perspective as to who the MMA are. Keep in mind, we're not going to examine the Quranic verses yet, but what we're doing here is simply gaining hints and clues to see who the MMA are. The first thing I'd like to point out is in Surah 4, verse 33, which talks about the inheritance. It says, "And for each we have made inheritors for what was left behind by the parents and the relatives, and those bound by your oaths, you shall give them their portion." Here we learn, or we gain a hint, that a person that is bounded by your oaths, or the MMA, is a person you promise to care for. This is why they are part of the inheritance system. Another verse I would like to point out is Surah 24, verse 33. It says, "And they are to maintain their chastity if they do not find marriage until God enriches them from his bounties. And those seeking for the arrangement of marriage from those possessed by your oaths, then arrange for them if you acknowledge goodness in them." This verse is talking about marrying off and encouraging the believer to marry off the MMA. This indicates for us that the MMA can be male or female. Another verse is Surah 16, verse 71. "God has preferred some of you over others in provision, yet those who have been preferred will not relinquish their provisions to those possessed by their oaths, that they may become equals in it." Here, God is simply forewarning the believer, telling him that you may become worried that the MMA may become equals in you in provisions. This indicates for us that the MMA come from a poor and or broken family. The next verse is Surah 33, verse 50. "O Prophet, we have made lawful for you the wives to whom you have already given their dowries, and those possessed by your oaths as granted to you by God." The Arabic phrase that's underlined here is "Mimma afa Allahu alayk." This phrase refers to specifically war type of situation. So God has granted the Prophet those possessed by your oaths from a war-torn situation. This verse teaches us that those possessed by our oaths may also come from war-torn situations. So this is what the Quran, these are the verses that give us hints and clues as to who are the MMA. Just to give you a visual perspective, imagine that there is a privileged family, okay? And you have another family or even single persons that come from a war-torn or poor broken family. If this privileged family chooses to embrace and take in the war-torn or poor broken family under their wing, this privileged family now has what is called the MMA, the Ma Malakat Aymanukum. Now, this brings us to the whole topic of the MMA and slavery. Once again, the MMA, or Ma Malakat Aymanukum, literally means those possessed by your oaths, and this phrase refers to a person you promise to care for. They could be male or female, they can come from a poor or broken family, or they can come from a war-torn situation. When it comes to slavery, there's only a few verses that actually talk about it. 24:32 is the primary one. It says, "And you shall marry off the single from among you, and the righteous from your slave men and your slave women." The Arabic word for slave men is ibadikum. The Arabic word for slave women is ima'ikum. And this is the only verse that specifically talks about believers' slaves. There are two other verses, like in 2:178, which talks generally about capital punishment and how capital punishment can apply to the slaves as well. And in 26:22, it talks about specifically about Pharaoh's slaves. This is the only verse that specifically talks about the believers' slaves, male and female slaves. And in this verse, it's actually encouraging the believer to marry them off. What is more interesting, though, is how the Quran is actually liberating the status of slavery. In the next verse, it says, "And they are to maintain their chastity if they do not find marriage until God enriches them from his bounties. And those seeking for the arrangement of marriage from those possessed by your oaths," the MMA. Note here, God did not call them slave men and slave women in this verse. He called them the MMA. This indicates that the slave men and women are now the MMA. God is no longer calling them the ibad and the ima. He's calling them the MMA. In other words, the Quran is actually liberating the status of slavery to MMAs, to become those possessed by our oaths. In other words, the slave men and slave women are the persons you promised to care for. They are no longer your slaves. And again, I'll give you a visual representation here. You have a slave. If an owner, if a believer has a slave or owns a slave, God is telling them they are no longer your slaves. They are your MMA. They are the persons you promised to care for. They can still work for you. They can still be your servants, but they are no longer your slaves. The Quran also addresses how the MMA play a role in a social status. Keep in mind that the Quran is actually addressing something that was happening 1400 years ago, and although the principles can still apply to us today, again, it's addressing something that was happening at that time. I'll bring your attention to Surah 4, verse 24. Where God says, "And forbidden for marriage are the fortified from the women except the MMA." The fortified from the women except the MMA. So here there are two different social status. We have the fortified and we have the MMA. The Arabic word for fortified is al-muhsanat, and it comes from the root hasana, which means to be protected by being lofty and thus inaccessible. Some have said al-muhsanat refers to chaste women or married women or believing women. However, Quranically speaking, muhsanat refers to free women. They are protected from slavery. This is why they're called muhsanat. They're from a status that is protected from becoming slaves or having the MMA status. But again, the Quran is liberating the MMA. In the next verse, God talks about conditions for marrying an MMA. And God says, "And for those of you unable to wait to marry the fortified from the believing women." So God here is talking about a person unable to wait to marry from the fortified of the believing women, then from those from the MMA, from your young believing women from the MMA. So God is giving the believer the permission to marry from the MMA. But God is setting conditions here. He says, marry them by their family's permission and give them their dowries. So two conditions must be met: taking permission from the family and giving them their dowries. Once these two criteria are met, these MMAs become fortified. And this is why the verse says, "And when they become fortified." The MMA become free and protected through dowry and marriage. This is how one of the ways that the MMAs become free. They reach freedom status or fortified status after they receive a dowry and then they become married. So let's briefly recap what we have learned so far, and then we're going to delve into the specifics of each verse, God willing. The phrase "ma malakat aymanukum" literally means what possessed of your oaths. It's a person you promise to care for from a different social status, as we have seen. This person can come from a poor or broken or war-torn family, and if it is a pre-existing slave, they are now your servants. They are no longer your slaves, they are your servants. This is the general idea of what "ma malakat aymanukum" means and who they are according to the Quran. Now, let's delve into the specifics and break down each and every verse in which this phrase occurs. So let's start with Surah 4, verse 36, which talks about how the MMA must be treated. In 436 it says, "And serve God and do not set up anything with him, and do good to the parents, the relatives, the orphans, the needy, the neighbor who is a relative, the neighbor nearby, and the friend nearby, and the wayfarer, and those possessed by your oaths. God does not love the arrogant, the boastful." This verse is crystal clear how the MMA must be treated. They are part of the category of who must be treated with respect. So God commands us to give the MMA the same respect as you give your parents, their relatives, the orphans, etc. We also learn from this verse that the MMA are not categorically part of the family, but must be treated in the same standards as everyone else. The Quran also points to the fact how the MMAs must be paid. Again, some of the MMAs were actually servants of the household. They did work, and the Quran is pointing to the fact that the believer must pay the MMAs for their work. These MMAs most likely used to be slaves of the household. Then their status changed to MMAs, as we have seen. And now the Quran is telling the believer that these people must be paid. They are people that you promise to care for, and therefore they must be paid for their work. And we can see this in 1671, where God says, God has preferred some of you over others in the provisions. So it is not for those who are preferred to give their provisions onto the MMA so they can become equals in it. Is it the favors of God that they deny? Here, this verse is somewhat rhetorical. It's pointing to the fact how some people, how some believers were feeling quite greedy in wanting to give their own provisions to the MMA. And God here says, is it the favors of God that they deny? So they must pay the MMAs for their work. And we can see this also in 30:28. God has put forth for you an example from among yourselves, as there for you from the MMA, from partners in what he has provided for you so that you become equals in it. Again, speaking of equality, people were afraid of having the MMAs having the same provisional equalities as themselves. This again points to how there's a difference in social status. So, two things we learned from these two verses. A believer is required to pay from his or her earnings to the MMA. A believer must not be greedy with providing earnings to the MMA. The Quran also sets a standard for the MMA and privacy. Let's take a look at 23:6 and 70:30, where God says, and those for their sexual gaps are maintaining, except unto their spouses or the MMA. Now, it is commonly understood that this verse is referring to sex. Some people believe, or a lot of people interpret this verse to referring to keeping your chastity except with the spouse or the MMA. However, if we cross-examine this particular verse with Surah 24, verse 30 and 31, where God is using the same term, maintaining, or hafilun in Arabic, we will see that this verse is ultimately referring to nudity. It has nothing to do with sex, but it's more about nudity. God says, and those for their sexual gaps are hafilun, maintaining or retaining, except onto the spouse or the MMA. And think of it this way. There are, in some countries and cultures and families, people who have MMAs in their household. The MMAs are their caretakers. They work with them in the nude. They work with them in their private quarters. They dress them, undress them, bathe them, and so forth. So this is what this verse is talking about. It's not talking about sex. It's talking about retention of your sexual gaps from the public, and rather you can be in the nude with the spouse or the MMA. We go to Surah 24, verse 31, where God says, tell the believing women to soften from their gaze and not to display their beautifications except to their fathers, or the fathers of their husbands, or their sons, or the sons of their husbands, or their MMA. Again, this verse is talking about how women can relax their dress code in the presence of the MMA. We go to Surah 24, verse 58. God says, O you who believe, they are to take your permission, those possessed by your oaths, and those who have not attained puberty from among you 3 times. Here we see that God is talking about the 3 privacy times that a person can request, and therefore these are considered the privacy times in which the MMA must take permission to enter the rooms. So the MMA must adhere to the general rules of the house concerning privacy. So let's revisit Surah 4 verse 24, which talks about the general conditions for marriage. God says, "And forbidden from marriage are the fortified from the women except the MMA, an arrangement of God unto you, and permitted for you what is beyond this, so long as you pursue with your money, fortifying without spreading. So what you benefited with it from them, give them their dowries as an obligation, and there's no foul upon you in what you agreed upon with it after the obligation, for God is knowledgeable, wise." Now, there are a handful of things I want to mention here, so please bear with me. First of all, unfortunately, this verse has been highly misused and abused by some sects of traditional Islam who believe that this verse refers to temporary marriage or prostitution, which is not the case. So let's take this from the very top. God says, "Forbidden from marriage are the fortified from the women except the MMA." We already noted what the word fortified means. It refers to being protected from slavery status. They are free people. The Arabic word for women is nisa, and in this context it refers to married women. So God says, "And forbidden from marriage are the free women who are already married, except the MMA." So in other words, God is allowing a person to marry an already married MMA. But why? Well, we need to understand two things here. First of all, the MMAs are oftentimes servants working in a household, and they oftentimes come from a poor, broken, or war-torn family. And second of all, and most importantly, these MMAs, particularly the ones that come from a war-torn situation, oftentimes do not go through the appropriate channels of divorce when they flee their husbands, like in Surah 60 verse 10. And I invite everybody to go to this particular verse. In this verse, in Surah 60 verse 10, we see that the women are fleeing their disbelieving husbands during war and going off to get married to the believing men during war. And there's conditions for that. So this indicates for us that these types of women have not gone through the appropriate channels of divorce. And this is what God is talking about here. It is not talking about any type of forced marriage or anything of that sort, because that's very indicative actually in the next verse, verse 25, which we will cover. But in this situation, but in this case, God is simply telling us that a person can marry an already married MMA because a lot of times these types of MMAs have not gone through the appropriate channels of divorce. Let's carry on. God says, "Forbidden from marriage are the fortified from the women except the MMA. This is an arrangement of God unto you, and permitted for you what is beyond this, so long as you pursue with your money, fortifying without spreading." So God here is setting three criterias for marriage. Pursue with your money. This is referring to the dowry. And we need to understand here, at least in the Arabian tradition, the dowry was contingent to the status of the person that they're getting married to. Fortified women cost more than the MMA. God says, so long as you pursue with your money, fortifying. The Arabic word for fortifying is the same as the one mentioned here, which is muhsinin. And it means that this person is promising to give his spouse the fortification status. Then God says, without spreading, غَيْرَ مُسَافِحِينَ. Musafihin refers to spreading your relationship to other relationships, having an open relationships. So in other words, God says, God sets three criteria for marriage. He says they must give a dowry, they promise to give protection status, and to be devoted to the relationship. Then God says, so what you benefited with it from them, give them their dowries as an obligation. This particular phrase, unfortunately, has been misunderstood that it's referring to some type of prostitution or temporary marriage. But this is not the case. God says, so what you benefited with it from them. The it here refers to the money, the them refers to the women. Basically, God is telling you, so what you benefited with your money, so what you find beneficial to the money that you have for a dowry, from the women, give them their dowries. So if you find that the MMAs are more affordable than the fortified, then you can give them the dowries as an obligation. If you find that the fortified are affordable for a dowry, then you can give them their dowries as well. Then God says, and there is no foul upon you what you agreed upon with it after the obligation. The agreement here, God is simply telling us that additional income for the spouse may be given after the dowry has been set. So this is what this verse is talking about. It has nothing to do with temporary marriage or prostitution or forced marriage or anything along those lines. Once we read this verse contextually and holistically, Quranically, then we will see that this verse is actually, again, setting the conditions, the general conditions for marriage. So now we're moving into the next verse, which is verse 25 of Surah 4, which is specifically zooming in on the conditions for marrying the MMA. In this verse, God says, and for those of you unable to wait to marry the fortified from the believing women, then from the MMA, from your young believing female servants. Marry them with their parents' permission and bring them their due dowries with acceptance. The MMA, in this case, must agree to become fortifying without spreading and not taking secret partners. So when they become fortified and if they approach lewdness, then upon them is half of what the naturally fortified women have from punishment. And again, I have a handful of things I want to mention here. Let's start from the top. And for those of you unable to wait to marry the fortified from the believing women, this isn't just about time. It's also about money. It's affordability. God says, basically, if you cannot wait or afford the fortified believing women, then you can marry from the MMA, from your young believing female servants. Then God is setting the conditions for marrying such people. God says, so marry them with their parents' permission. That is the first condition for wanting to get married to an MMA. You must obtain a parent's or a relative's permission. This alone indicates that marrying the MMA is never a forced marriage. You must obtain permission. Then God says, and bring them their due dowries with acceptance. Bil ma'ruf. Acceptance is bil ma'ruf. Thing that is acceptable to her and also to her family. So again, this indicates that it's not some type of forced marriage or anything along those lines, as some people believe. God here is setting an absolute condition for marrying these type of people. Then the verse says, محصنات غير مسافحات ولا متخذات أخدان. This is in the feminine form, referring to the woman who agrees, the MMA who agrees to get married. So the MMA agrees to become fortifying without spreading and not taking secret partners. She is basically promising in return that she agrees to attain protection status, no sex outside of marriage. Then God says, so when they become fortified, and I already mentioned this earlier, فَإِذَا أُحْصِنَّ, when they become fortified. Again, this is a liberating status for the MMA. After these conditions are met, they become fortified. So if a person wants to get married to an MMA, he must obtain permission from the parents and provide dowry with acceptance. After this happens, she becomes fortified. She obtains the protection status or the freedom status. So MMA become protected, free, when points 1 through 3 are fulfilled. And again, this denotes for us that the Quran is actually liberating the MMAs. Then God says and warns the MMAs, if they approach lewdness, then upon them is half of what the naturally fortified women have from punishment. So here we see that even though they became fortified status, they are not the naturally fortified women, and they get half of the punishment that is received if they commit any type of lewdness. The MMA receives half of lewdness punishment than the naturally protected women. So this is what this verse is talking about. It has nothing to do, again, with any type of forced marriage. This verse actually shows us that there's conditions for marrying the MMA and how the Quran is actually liberating the women from MMA status to fortification status. We go to Surah 24 verse 33, which talks about how the believers are encouraged to free the MMA via marriage. The verse reads, "And they, the single, are to maintain their chastity if they do not find marriage until God enriches them from his bounties. And those seeking for the arrangement of marriage from those possessed by your oaths, then arrange for them if you acknowledge goodness in them and bring to them from God's wealth that he brought for you." Here we learn that God is telling the single people to maintain their chastity until they find someone to marry and that they can afford it. Then God also says, and those seeking for the arrangement from the MMA, then arrange for them if you acknowledge goodness in them. So if the MMA is requesting to get married, the believer is required to make the appropriate arrangements for the marriage. And God also says, and bring to them from God's wealth that he brought for you. So the believer in this case is also required to at least help with the payment of the dowry. So as we can see, the Quran is actually encouraging the believer to let go of the MMA if they are requesting to get married. But the second part of this verse gets quite interesting. It says, "Do not force your female servants onto the seeking if they want to become fortified so that you seek worldly gains. And whoever forces them, then God, after their being forced, is forgiving, merciful." So here, interestingly, this last part of this verse is often understood to be referring to prostitution. This is because the Arabic word al-bigha is understood to be referring to prostitution. And although bigha in Arabic does refer to prostitution, this is not the case in this verse. Bigha comes from the root baghaya, which means the seeking of something. And the same word here is used in the same verse. It's the seeking for the arrangement of marriage. So the bigha here is referring actually to arranged marriage, not prostitution. So God says, do not force your female servants, your MMA female servants, onto an arranged marriage if these women are wanting to become fortified. They want to get married to a person that is a free status. And a lot of times, at least at that time, the person, the caretaker, didn't want his female servants, the female servants, to marry a free person because they wanted them to still work for them. And this is why the verse says, so that you seek worldly gains. So God here is telling the believer, don't do that. Don't do any forced marriage. Don't make them marry another MMA. Let them marry a free person if they choose to. So again, God says, do not force your female servants onto the seeking if they want to become fortified so that you seek worldly gains. Do not force an arranged marriage if the MMA is specifically choosing to marry a free person. And despite that, interestingly, God still will forgive them. So this is what this verse is talking about. No prostitution. God is simply telling the believer to marry off the MMA if they are requesting to get married, and even help them with the marriage process. We now go to Surah 33 verse 50, which talks about how the Prophet was actually exempt from giving the dowry to the MMA as well as two other categories of women. Unfortunately, some of the Christian missionaries tend to quote this verse and try to show that the prophet was taking advantage of his prophethood situation and trying to marry as many women as he wants without a dowry. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Let's take a look at Surah 33, verse 50. It says, O prophet, we have made lawful for you your spouses, the ones you brought their dowries, and what was possessed of your oath of what was returned in war by God unto you, and your cousins, those who emigrated with you, and a woman, if she gifted herself to the prophet, if the prophet wanted to marry her, she is exclusive for you without the other believers. We have known what was ordained upon them, the believers, in their spouses, and what was possessed by their oaths. So there's no upon you hardship. Here we need to note, O prophet, we have made lawful for you your spouses, the ones you brought their dowries. So this is clear that God made lawful for the prophet the spouses that he already gave them their dowries. Then God starts listing off 3 categories of women who are exempt from the dowry. The first one is what was possessed of your oath of what was returned in war by God unto you. The phrase mimma afa Allahu alayk refers specifically to the MMAs who come from a war-torn situation or condition. The next one is, and your cousins, those who emigrated with you. So specifically the cousins of the prophet who specifically emigrated with him. Then the third category is the woman who gifted herself to the prophet. So if a woman does not request a dowry, then the prophet can marry her in this situation. For the regular believer, they still have to give a dowry, no matter what. Even if she doesn't want one, he still has to give her a dowry. But in the prophet's situation, she does not have to. Now the question that really comes to mind, why is the prophet exclusive to these dowry exemptions? And the answer is, and I invite everybody to do this, is that if you go to verses 29 through 35, I believe, which talks generally about the prophet's women, we will see that the prophet actually during his lifetime married a variety of women, I should say. And these women come from all sorts of backgrounds. Some, based off of those verses, some were actually not well behaved, I should say, quote unquote, not well behaved. And some actually came from a very low status or high status. There's, again, a variety of women from different backgrounds. So God seems to give him exemption status simply because it was creating a hardship, as this verse indicates. So there is no upon you any hardship. Now, let's go very briefly to the next verse, because this verse unfortunately has also been misused by some. The verse, it is said that this verse talks about his sexual relationships with them, where it says, you may defer what you will from among them, and shelter to whom you will, and whoever you seek of those who have you set aside, and there is no wrong upon you. That is closer to settling their eyes, and they do not be saddened and to accept what you have brought all of them. Unfortunately, this verse has been misunderstood. They say that this verse is talking about his role as a sexual person, each night visiting one woman, putting the other one aside and taking the other one, and so forth. And again, this is an unfortunate attempt to read the Quranic verses out of context. When we read this verse in context, we see that the previous verse is talking exclusively about the dowries. And so we must bear in mind that the next verse is also talking in the context of the dowries. You may defer what you will from among them in reference to the dowry, and shelter to whom you will in reference to the dowry, and whoever you seek of those who you have set aside, setting aside the dowry, then there's no wrong upon you. That is closer to settling their eyes, and they do not be saddened, and to accept what you have brought all of them. This is the key phrase. Brought all of them is the same reference in regards to bringing the dowry in the context that is being talked about. This has nothing to do with sex. It is all about how the prophet was distributing the dowry. So even though God gave the prophet three exemption categories of dowries, the next verse indicates that the prophet was actually trying his best to still give the dowries to those particular women. And that's why they were saying that is closer to settling their eyes, and they do not be saddened, and to accept what you have brought, all of them. It has nothing to do with sex as is commonly understood. Now, in the previous slide, which mentions verse 50 and 51 of Surah 33, we see in those verses God is talking about the various dowry rules in regards to the prophet's marriage. Now, in this verse, God is talking about placing a limit of marriage categories for the prophet, and the fact that he may be able to change the MMAs for marriage, and we will see why. This verse reads, "Unlawful for you are the women after this, nor that you change them from spouses, even if you are impressed by their goodness, except what you possess of your oath." The first thing I'd like to point out here is that God says, "Unlawful for you are the women after this, nor that you change them from spouses." So God here is placing a limit for the marriage. God is telling the prophet you can no longer get married even if you want to change the number of spouses that you have. And God says, even if you are impressed by their husnuhunna, okay? The Arabic word husnuhunna does not mean their beauty as commonly understood. The word husnuhunna actually comes from the word hasana, which simply means something that is good. And in the context of what we are talking about, within the same surah, verse 29, God is talking to the prophet's women. He says, "But if you are seeking God and his messenger and the abode of the hereafter, then God has prepared for the muhsinat among you a great reward." So God here is talking about the quality of the woman being a good person. This is why he calls them muhsinat. So the word husnuhunna in this verse does not mean their beauty. It's not about sex. It's about their goodness. So God says, even if the prophet is impressed by their goodness, he's not allowed to marry more or exchange the wives that he's marrying. So the goodness of the women is her righteousness, not her beauty. Then we come to what God says here, except your MMA. So God says that the prophet is not allowed to marry any more women nor change them, but he can change the MMAs. And there is a real reason why, as we have seen from the other verses that talk about the conditions and what happens when you marry an MMA. And the very reason is because God forbade the prophet from exchanging marital relations except the MMA. This is because the MMA are freed through marriage. So the prophet was allowed to marry MMAs and exchange them simply because the MMAs are become free after getting married. So God is again liberating the MMAs in this situation. The last verse on our list is Surah 4, verse 3, which talks about polygamy. God says, "If you fear that you cannot be just to the orphans, then you may marry those who are agreeable to you of the women, 2, 3, and 4. But if you fear you will not be fair, then only one, or those possessed by your oaths. This is best that you do not face financial hardship." Now we need to understand here. God says, if you fear that you cannot be just to the orphans, then you may marry those who are agreeable to you of the women, 2, 3, and 4. This teaches us, along when we read the previous verse, verse 2, this teaches us that polygamy is allowed only for the sake of taking care of the orphans. Then God says, but if you fear you will not be just to these orphans, then marry only one woman or the MMA. It's important to understand here the word or, in Arabic. This indicates for us that you can marry either one person or an MMA. This teaches us that ultimately this is all about affordability. If a person is unable to be fair, then only one or an MMA. This indicates for us also that the MMA are given a special privilege and protection by not being part of a polygamous relationship. Note here how God says, then marry only one person or an MMA, which teaches us that the MMA are not part of a polygamous relationship. Of course, this does not apply to the Prophet as we have seen in the other verses in Surah 33. This applies generally for all the other believers. In conclusion, the phrase مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ that is mentioned in the Quran literally means what possessed by your oaths. And these are individuals that you promise to care for. These individuals can come from a poor or broken family, they can come from a war-torn situation, or they are pre-existing slaves. Nonetheless, they all are what possessed by your oaths. They are people that you promise to care for. And the Quran is clear about it. The Quran says that these individuals must be respected. They must be paid, especially the servants, the pre-existing slaves who become servants. They are part of the household, and the Quran encourages the believer to support freedom via marriage. I pray that this has helped you understand what مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ is according to the Quran, and inshallah, as always, see you in the next video. Just as a side note, folks, the translation provided in this particular segment was my personal translation of the Quran. It is a word-for-word translation, and this is why you may see that the English doesn't flow very nicely. It's because I was trying to convey exactly how the wording is in the Arabic text. I also tried my best to focus in on the root definitions of some particular terms to show how the word is utilized in the Arabic text. Wassalamu alaikum.